So. Hello everyone, and welcome to this, our final webinar of the year, which is on looking at the use of boarding school places for disadvantaged children in social work. I will just wait for a minute to allow people to join the session, and then we'll get started. Right, well, I'm going to get started. So again, thank you everyone for coming. My name's Susie Hawkes. I'm a principal lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, and I'll be chairing the webinar for today. I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the use of boarding school places in social work, and just some context for this discussion. And then I'll introduce the participants, and I'll then we'll get on with people sort of talking about their experiences of it. So I think just as a start, really, until about the 1970s, local authorities routinely supported several thousand children, vulnerable children, in boarding school places, with only a handful of children. So there were far fewer children in care in the way that we think of them today. Local authorities often ran their own boarding schools in order to provided their own boarding schools in order to care for looked after children, or children who were disadvantaged. However, the picture has now changed. The scheme fell out of favour, and this was felt to be largely due to the general perception of boarding schools as elitist and cold, and a growing emphasis placed in social work upon the importance of attachment theory, which led to a sort of preferential focus on individual child and carer relationships, and the importance of the carer figure in influencing the development and well-being of children. There's also been, alongside that, a large-scale reduction in the number of boarding school places in England due to a decreasing demand in the last 30 years. Although one of the main advantages and benefits of boarding school places has been seen as the educational attainment for children. The Royal Wanstead Children's Foundation found that 85% of children whose fees have been paid by a charity to the assisted boarding school system reached the same or better standards of education as fee-paying children at the same schools. It also found that boarding schools were highly effective in the recovery and of social skills, self-esteem and coping ability of children, vulnerable children, within 2 to 3 years. So coming to more recently, in 2006, the Labour government began a project called Pathfinders, where 10 local authorities across England were encouraged to use to identify children and young people who would be suitable to go into boarding places, who could no longer stay with their families on a full-time basis. The Thomas Coram Research Unit evaluated the project, producing a report in January 2009. The report identified that although 76 children had been originally identified as potentially suitable for places in a boarding place, that in the end only 17 young people ended up going into a boarding school place. But for those young people who attended, those 17, the outcomes were generally very positive. They found that although the scheme was slow to start, particularly in identifying appropriate young people for the scheme, once they had been identified, the children did very well and spoke positively of the placements. They identified that the best time to place children into boarding places was on the cusp of secondary school, so when children are about 10 till 11, and that that there was an emphasis on boarding school being considered for the most appropriate young people, that there had to be a good match, and that they were most successful when families were able to make decisions for themselves. And that's supported by other research around boarding school, use of boarding school places or boarding places for vulnerable children, which talks about the importance of the young people and their families buying into the place themselves, and finally the other issue is having an appropriate support in place in holidays. I think just finally, I think the other key issue, another key and important issue for this topic, is that this is quite a politically sensitive topic for a lot of social work, and I think it's important to acknowledge that right from the outset, that I think there is a perception, and it's been identified in some of the reports, that for social workers, that this is not seen as something that is a desirable thing to do, and I think that's something that we can talk about during the webinar. So I think just again in the final context is that there's also in recent years there's been a large growth in the looked after children, and something that the Independent Care Review is currently looking into, and I think this is an important webinar in the context of the Independent Care Review. The population of looked after children has sort of very much increased and has also diversified. So local authorities are taking into care a wider range of young people with a wider range of issues and needs. And so I think the consideration of boarding places should be thought of in that context of the increasing numbers and the wider range of young people. And whether it can be a helpful solution into meeting the needs of some of those young people, although I think we can acknowledge from the outset that we're not talking about the largest majority of young people. We're talking about a small minority of young people, but an important option for some of those children. So just before I introduce people, I didn't actually introduce, just to make it just some housekeeping, just to remind people that the webinar is being recorded, so you can use the chat facility, but just be mindful that anything you put in there or anything that's will be spoken out will be on the recording. If people want to ask questions, can you please use the Q&A facility? It's easier to find your questions and easier to ask them to the panel, and there will be an opportunity after the presentations to speak, to have a discussion and to answer questions that you might have about the use of boarding schools. To introduce people, to get on to the introductions, we have got Dr. Ruth Brading, who's from Christ's Hospital School, which I can't remember off the top of my head its date of establishment, but it's in the 16th century, isn't it? It's in 1550 something, I think.
That's right.
So, yeah, so Christ's Hospital have got a long history of supporting vulnerable children, and Ruth will talk to us about that. Next we have Mark Haywood, Mr. Mark Haywood, who is the head teacher at the Royal in Wolverhampton, which is a state boarding school, and works closely with Wolverhampton Council around supporting vulnerable children at his school. And then we have Kate Robinson, who is a service manager. Kate, is that right? Yeah, service manager for children in care and those care leavers at the City of Wolverhampton. And Kate is going to talk to us about their experiences of placing children in state boarding school. And finally, we will have Lord Andrew Adonis, who's going to come and speak to us about his involvement in support for the placement of children in boarding schools. Lord Adonis was himself a looked after child. He was in the care of Camden Council until he was 16, and he attended state boarding school from the age of 11, and he went on to attend Oxford, I believe off the top of my head, and has obviously a degree and a PhD from Oxford, and has been a strong supporter of the use of boarding school as a means of supporting young people who are vulnerable. So I shall be quiet now and hand over to Dr. Ruth Brading from Christ Hospital. So thank you and welcome, and thank you for coming, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Susie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. Yeah, my name's Ruth Brading, and I'm Deputy Head with oversight of all pupil matters at our school, Christ Hospital. We're an independent co-ed boarding school. We're near Horsham in Sussex. We're quite unusual as independent boarding schools go, as I'll explain in a little while. But first of all, I'd really like to thank Susie for inviting me to take part today. Having worked with many social workers when I was designated safeguarding lead at my school, I have huge admiration and respect for your profession. You do such an important job, often challenging and difficult, I know. So thank you very much for having me at your webinar. I'm here today, as Susie said, to just share my thoughts really about how and when in our experience, placements in boarding schools can work for children who may be looked after or living with adults other than their parents, perhaps with grandparents or other family members, who may be on the edge of care in some way. And in particular, I'd really like to reflect on the details that we have found really need to be taken into consideration, the details about boarding life really, if you are thinking about a boarding placement for a particular child, because there are some very important specific questions that need to be asked and answered really honestly, I think, if we're going to make sure that we are placing children responsibly and positively and setting them up for success in that placement. Because as you, of course, know better than anyone, it's so important that we don't put in place something that is unlikely to work for a child, especially for a child who may have experienced loss or abandonment already, and we don't want to add another loss to a child's experience. So it's really important to go about it the right way with a lot of honesty, I think, and Susie and I have talked about that before. First of all, I would like to tell you a little bit about our school, where I've worked for 17 years now, by way of context, and also in case you want to consider us for any of the children you work with, because we are pretty unusual. Christ Hospital has been around, as Susie said, since the middle of the 16th century. We used to be in the City of London, but we moved to a big campus in rural Sussex about 120 years ago. Our name, Christ's Hospital, does often raise a few eyebrows. We haven't ever been a hospital in the ordinary sense, the modern sense of the word. We were founded as what was then known as a hospital, in the sense of being a refuge or a place, a safe haven, a hospitable place, a hospital in the sense of being hospitable. We were founded for homeless children who were on the streets of London in 1552. And then over the centuries, we have evolved into a boarding school, but kept the name hospital. And crucially, as we've evolved, we have kept our charitable ethos and our mission to provide a second home, in a sense, especially to children who have a need of any kind to board. So large numbers of the children who are with us do have a specific need to come away from their home for 33 weeks of the year and live with us for all sorts of reasons. And the reason that Christ Hospital is able to do this and keep this ethos and this mission going is that we have a very, very significant bursary system, a much larger bursary system than most independent schools. At least 75% of our pupils at any one time have bursaries, and those range in value, if you like. About 100 of our 900 pupils have full bursaries, so their families pay no boarding or tuition fees at all, and a full third of our families pay 10% or less of their costs. And that's important because the result of that is that our pupil body is very diverse indeed in socioeconomic terms. And it's also very diverse, as it happens, in terms of ethnicity. And I wanted to share that with you because what it means in turn is that no child has reason to feel or look out of place here, because of that diversity that we have. Some children will feel out of place or tell us that they feel out of place, of course, because it is something that adolescents do feel sometimes. But in actuality, there's no reason for any child to feel that they're the odd one out here because of our diversity. And I wanted to just tell you that little bit about Christ Hospital, because we are always keen to get the word out, because it is our mission to allocate our places to the children who will benefit from them the most. And so we're always trying to spread that message. But going on now to the considerations that need to be borne in mind if you're going to consider a boarding place at our school or at any boarding school for a child. I think when people think about boarding schools, often what they think of first is the structure, the routine, the rules, and how helpful those things can be to a young person. And they're not wrong about there being lots of structure and lots of routine here and at all boarding schools, I think. So, for example, our youngest pupils have to be at the dining hall for their breakfast at 7 a.m. So they have to get up early. And then they have a roll call in their boarding house, and then their lessons start at 8:30. Our school day is much longer than day school days are. So we have activities in the afternoon, and then our juniors, who are in years 7, 8 and 9, do their prep, which is what we call homework, from 5 till 6 p.m. in a classroom all together with all the other children who are in their boarding house. And then they have their tea. So it's a long, structured, busy day. We have a uniform, a really unusual uniform, because that's been around since the 16th century as well. And we have a lot of rules, and we have high behaviour expectations. And we have quite a lot of traditions and customs that do bind our pupils together and give them a kind of shared identity, especially in their 16 different boarding houses. So it is correct to think of boarding school as a very structured, organised place. And that can really suit a young person who likes or needs structure and sort of discipline in that sense. And in addition, of course, boarding schools offer a huge range of opportunities in terms of all the extracurricular activities. We have loads of sport, music, drama, as you would probably think, outward bound activities, debating, community service, and all of those kinds of things, which I think everyone associates with boarding school. But having said that, I think there is another aspect of boarding school that it is really essential to mention, because it's perhaps not something that strikes people. Probably most people probably haven't ever set foot in a boarding school. Why would you? And so it might be hard to imagine what it's like. And so the point I really want to highlight is that whilst we do have that really busy day, structured day with routines and activities and supervised meals and sign-ins, there is also, conversely, quite a bit of unsupervised time in a way, which I'd like to explain. We have lots of staff who help to look after the children. We have house parents and matrons and teachers, of course, and nurses and chaplains and therapists and so on. But we are a 24/7 environment, of course. Our children are actually with us for 3 weeks at a time. And the pupils are living in boarding houses of around 45 pupils. So whilst there are always adults on hand for the young people to go to and get support from and guidance, and help, the young people are living in very close quarters with one another. And I think it's fair to say and honest to say that they don't get as much one-to-one time with adults as a child who's going home to a family each evening would get. And I think that's really important to take on board. And it's one of the reasons I'm really pleased that Susie invited me to come today, because what it means is that children do need to have a certain level of resilience to cope well with boarding life. And they also need to be able to live peaceably in these very close quarters with other young people. And it's really important to think about that when you're thinking about whether this might suit any particular child. If we're being honest about it, some children, if they do have a very narrow window of tolerance, if they do find it hard to self-regulate or lose their temper very easily, might not be suitable for boarding, especially if they can sometimes get physical with others when they're upset. That close living in close quarters with others, it might not suit them. And I just think it's so important to think honestly about that, as I said at the beginning, so we don't set a child up to fail. So I think honesty is what it's all about. So just to sum up my perspective, I would say, please do consider boarding schools as a potential placement for children, especially, I think, and Susie sort of touched on this when she talked about broadening out the title of this webinar, especially for children who have a family placement which is working for them, but from which they might need a break or a reprieve, or the family might need a bit of respite, because boarding schools can really help to provide some balance in that way, with children, certainly at our school, spending, as I said, 33 weeks of the year here, and then 19 weeks of the year, so still a considerable period of time with the people with whom they live in the holidays. It's essential to plan ahead and be really open and honest with any boarding school that you're engaging with. If the school isn't the right fit, none of us would want to set that child up for failure. So, for example, our school, Christ Hospital, is also a relatively academic school. Okay, the pace is relatively sort of high. So a child would struggle here if they weren't reasonably academically inclined. And that's another thing it's really important to be honest about, because we want the children to feel confident and comfortable and that they can cope with what our particular school is like. As Susie said, and I completely agree, the best time for a child to start at boarding school, if possible, is when the majority of other children are starting, which in our case is at year 7, just like every regular secondary school. That's where we start. That is the best time, because it's easier for the children to come in with the majority of the other children when they're all joining, and to have that introduction to our school that all the year 7s have as a group. Although, of course, you know, we do take children in at other points if that's right for them. So my message would be, plan ahead, communicate with the school's admissions department as much as possible, be really open and honest about a child's needs and about their ability to live in very close quarters with other children, and not always under the immediate supervision by adults, because they're not, although there are loads and loads of adults here to help them in all sorts of ways. And if you can do all of that, you can find a match. You might be able to find a really good match. And you may find that a boarding school placement can help sustain a family placement. I think that is sometimes the best way to look at it. And it can be absolutely transformative for a child because of the opportunities that it opens up and the skills and qualities that it can really help them to develop. So that's my perspective. It's not hugely complex, but I think those points are really important. Thank you very much, Susie, for giving me the opportunity.
Oh, thank you, Ruth. That's I think it's really, I think it is really important to understand, and I think something I learned in preparing for this webinar is actually the breadth of opportunities that are around in terms of boarding schools. And I think that was not something that I was mindful of before I started thinking about it. I think I was similarly had a narrow view of what types of what boarding school was, but there are obviously a range of types of boarding school, which I think Mark is going to coming on to Mark, is going to explain and talk to us about another type of boarding school that's slightly different to in its origins to Christ's Hospital. So Mark Haywood from the Royal in Wolverhampton, I shall hand over to you. Thank you, Mark, for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Susie. Thanks, Ruth. I think, first of all, as Ruth has said, I'm absolutely delighted to be invited today to give a view, and happy to take any questions that might arise from that, either on the webinar or later on. I agree with absolutely everything Ruth has said, and I suppose you would expect me to. And our school is young by comparison, that we were founded in 1850, yesterday by comparison. But we were founded, the antecedent school, as an orphanage as a result of the cholera epidemics in the Black Country. We converted from an independent school in 2016 to a state-funded boarding school and a day school. And we have now 1,455 children on site, 80 to 100 of whom are boarders. So we're predominantly a day school from 4 to 19. And we also serve a large community service with swimming pools and other facilities. So we sit right slap bang in the West Midlands in our community, and it always has done. But what has changed is in becoming a free school in 2016, which I think Andrew Adonis would kind of applaud in terms of the movement that he led through. We actually, for me, it was reverting to what we started out to do, to actually enabling young people who might not have the opportunity for stability and opportunity to actually grab hold of that. And as an independent school, and I've been here since 2011, we did have young people looked after children from local authorities, from the 5 surrounding local authorities. We worked with a number of different trusts, the RNCF, Springboard, Buttle, and a whole range of others. We've got a filing cabinet full of different trusts that we used to apply to in the same way that Ruth will for additional funding support, and had our own foundation support that we used. And sadly, in the conversions, much of that has gone. So we don't have that philanthropic pot to call upon, and therefore we have to look in other ways. And we've got a fantastic relationship with Ali Henderson at the Springboard, and I've been talking with her this morning about some more youngsters hoping to join in the coming year, some in-year transfers and some at the end of the year. I would agree with Ruth that the younger we take on these youngsters, the greater is the potential for significant and sustained change for these guys and girls. And that really does make a difference. I suppose what Susie is kind of really alluding to is that since 2015, and we were an independent school at that point, we've engaged with Wolverhampton Local Authority, because I've been part of the safeguarding board throughout that period, to actually take on some unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. And since that time, we've had 17 young people, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, girls and boys, who've come from a range of countries, initially from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, quite a few now from Afghanistan, Kurdistan, and other areas. And I'm, immensely proud to say that 4 of them have gone off to university, having been with us for 18 months, 2 years, with limited English, but at Swansea and at Coventry and other Liverpool University, and one. Ali will be going off this year, and he's got 5 choices and he's got 5 offers that he's sitting on, and he's been with us for 4 years, and it's just a wonderful opportunity to really make a sustained difference in youngsters who really don't have a lot and arrive in my study here with a black plastic bag. I think Ruth's point about us being alerted and planning early hasn't been possible for Wolverhampton Council because they've just got the National Transfer Scheme, and in some cases we've had 3 hours warning. So somebody, a male or female, somewhere around 14 to 16 is going to arrive. 3 hours later, they rock up at the door with a big plastic bag with their belongings in, and shiny new trainers and tracksuits that's been provided by Kent, usually, in terms of their designation. So those challenges are really interesting, but because we've been working as an international boarding school for many, many years, We have EAL specialisms, we have SEMH specialisms that we've built up over a period of time, working with youngsters from all over the world, and that continues. So we have, alongside our unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, we've got the opportunity for the normal border. We're not a boarding school that has always had, very wealthy parents who kind of discharge their children to the school for them to take on. Those modest incomes, the busy middle class families who can't devote the time to their youngsters in the way they would like to, see the boarding school as that structure where they have a larger family, and in the same way as Christ, we have a compulsory, for day pupils and boarding students, a compulsory enrichment program. So for 4 days a week, students stay here till 5 o'clock at night, and there's 100 different activities or enrichment activities on offer throughout the week. And that's for everybody. So our boarding students are very much a core of our day school, but it's very much part of that. And I think and again, Kate will probably kind of explain their view, but in terms of value for money, with particularly the looked after children and our unaccompanied youngsters, is our fees are £13,000 per year, and if you look at the social costs to a local authority of placing in a foster family with all the ancillary care that is needed, given that they support us immensely throughout the process, but they kind of discharge the care and the education to us in one package, which works really successfully, along with the local authority and the continual engagement with social workers and a range of other professionals, including CAMS, of course. But that is, I believe, and Kate will have a view, incredible value for money in terms of that social care and we're at school for some 37 weeks of the year. We remain open during the half terms because it's sensible to do so, and we've got the staffing to enable that to happen. We don't do exeats to make it kind of for those weekends in the middle of the term, which can be disruptive to all parents, not just local authorities who have to provide foster families and guardians for the holiday periods. I would agree with Ruth very much that if the more warning we have and the more engagement we have, like the meeting with Ali Henderson this morning, that's really helpful, because we can, and it is about managing expectations, as Ruth has said, because we're absolutely passionate that we don't want to be a short-term stay, because most of the youngsters that we're talking about today have had a disruptive life, education, and other journey, an emotional journey. And the worst thing that would happen is if we end up having to break that again, so that their trust is further broken, and those relationships and that development of relationships, those skills that they learn are further challenged. Where it works well, and we don't, with the US youngsters, we don't have that same long-term sight of where they're coming from, and nobody can give that's just not possible. But we've had some real successes. We've had some ones that haven't worked, and that's equally where the youngsters' expectation is that they're coming to work, they're coming to earn money, and the friction has sometimes been that the social care system hasn't provided them with always with the support that they would expect in terms of going into a job. Actually, no, you're in education till 16, till 18, and you must be there. And we've had some friction, is also that, there's a local community that they join in with, as we would if we're moving to a different country, where information is presented in a way for the young people that they have an entitlement at 16 to supported accommodation. And we've had two of our earlier unaccompanied seeking children who did go into supported living, who then came back into boarding, not because of anything other than the fact that they found that the boarding, the house parents actually were looking after them more than just kind of looking after a boarding setting. It was about their welfare, about their learning, about their relationships, their friendships, their activities, and taking them off to cricket practice, particularly for some of our youngsters from Afghanistan. It's absolutely massive for them to get into a cricket club. And the house parent is taking them off. So this evening, one of our house parents has taken them off to Molineux to watch one of our former pupils play for the under-18s in a FA Cup game. And that all of that experience, which they wouldn't normally get, perhaps if they're in a foster placement, and their family that they're growing up with, this broader group of students, has been a real benefit. And they've felt a little bit isolated sometimes when they've gone off to a single placement, whereas they've got this community around them. But that does cause challenges, as Ruth has identified, that, you know, some of them living in a community is a challenge for them, and they need to kind of moderate some of their tendencies. And for some of our looked after children who've come from very challenging backgrounds of domestic violence, where all that they've had modeled to them is you sort problems out with aggression, that sometimes has been a long-term process. There isn't a switch for some of these youngsters. They have a massively dysfunctional start to life, and we want to provide them with stability. And I do agree with Ruth. Structure is absolutely essential for these vulnerable youngsters. That we don't have the same uniform, although looking on our fireplace in our main hall, it used to be the same as Christ, but we left that behind sometime in the last century, I believe. But we do have a uniform. We do have high expectations, and they do have a prep session. They do have, they go to 5 in activities after their 6th period of academic progress. But then they have a supervised prep session. Then they have dinner together as a community of up to 100 children, and we have some day students who stay for the evening as well as kind of day boarders. But that structure is really important, and that's something particularly unaccompanied asylum seekers find challenging to start off with, because, and again, I sat with one of them who arrived last March in here on my computer, and we had a look at Google Earth, and to trace their journey, for me to have some sense of where they'd come from, not to probe too deeply. And these guys and girls have made their way, often alone or in groups, across the planet to arrive here. And then when they arrive in boarding, we're telling them at 5:30, that's your curfew. You're not going out into the city at that time because you're under our care. We have our own safeguarding rules that you have to abide by. And occasionally that's caused frictions. But that works really well when Kate and the social care system within the city support the school in actually understanding, no, there are regulations here, we have to abide by these, and it's for your welfare. And I think when it's a combined team of people around the child, it works really, really well. In Wolverhampton, 2 years ago, we had a fantastic program which was supported financially as a wellbeing and mental health for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. And that linked CAMS with the local authority, with a whole range of other services. And really, our youngsters thoroughly benefited from that. And I know, as Kate knows, I'm only sorry that that's, at the moment, has ceased because of perhaps of lack of funding, or that project's come to its natural conclusion. But for our youngsters, initiatives like that, where we're working with the local authority, we're identifying need, is really exciting proposition to actually get really good outcomes for these youngsters. So I think I've probably covered most of those areas that I think that we do. With our looked after children who come from local authorities, we do have a suitability for boarding interview. Our admissions procedures already prioritise vulnerable young children. We were delighted the year before last to get the Boarding Schools Association award for that year for working with vulnerable children, which is what the school was set up to do in 1850. And as a free school academy now, it's just so rewarding to see that we can go back to do that. But we do require the work of the local authority, and Wolverhampton have been unbelievably supportive and helpful in all of the things that we've tried to do with young people. And when it's not gone as well as it might have done, working with us to try and find solutions that actually are meaningful for youngsters. One of the challenges, and I'm sure it's in every local authority, is finding for those holiday weeks that we have, 3 weeks that we've got coming up, and again at Easter and the 7 weeks in the summer, is finding suitable care placements for them. And the youngsters, in lots of occasions, would rather stay in school. We just don't have the staffing to cope with that. And in a state boarding school, we're legislated that we can only charge the costs of boarding plus 8%. So it doesn't give us a huge flexibility to actually provide additional staffing that we might want to for other periods of time. But we do try and use the funding that we do have very well. So I think it can work. I think with working with a really positive relationship with the local authorities that are supporting the young people, that works really well. And we've done that certainly for all of my 11 years at the school. Early starts, young children work best, in my view, and I would agree with Ruth on that one. And where there is an understanding that there is a structure that you're coming to, and that actually working with the school, working with the social care system is actually, some of the outcomes can be absolutely remarkable. And it is lovely to see the success stories, and whether they're going to the local further education college or into apprenticeships or into university, all of that is a success where they continue to live independently, and then come back and visit and just tell us how well they're doing. So a whole range of different things, perhaps a different view from Ruth, but in terms of our journey and where we are currently, but it's something that we're really excited by. And if any other local authorities want to be in touch, I would suggest, be in touch with Wolverhampton and ourselves if there's a suitable placement that you consider. Susie, I think that's probably it, and happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. No, that's really helpful and really interesting to know, to understand how your school has evolved and used the free school system in order to sort of to carry on what you were originally set up to do. So yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. We'll go next to Kate, who is, as I said before, is a service manager for looked after children and care leavers at Wolverhampton City Council. So Kate, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Susan, and thanks very much for having me. I think Mark's kind of covered a lot of the things that I was going to talk about, really, so I'm going to echo a lot of what Mark said. But yeah, really pleased to be here. I think more so than anything, just to kind of get it out there and to share with people actually how Wolverhampton are already using boarding schools creatively, because I don't think people would have fully appreciated that we would use them for unaccompanied asylum seeker children. I think it's really important as well to know that actually when we're using this as a provision, as a resource, it's needs-led and not resource-led. So we don't struggle to place our unaccompanied asylum seeker children. We can place them in internal foster care placements, or we can place them in independent, and particularly we choose for independent, so private foster carers, because of the language or the cultural match. We try and match them as closely as we can. So it's not because we haven't got the resources. We choose to place our unaccompanied asylum seeker children into the boarding school provision where we can, obviously in line with capacity, because we do think it works, and we think that model works really well with these young people. So as Mark says, when they arrive into the country, we don't know, I don't think we'll ever fully appreciate what they've been through to get here, or what experience or trauma they've experienced to get to where they are. So to place them into a foster family, who then have to place them into a mainstream school, until this whole community, is really quite extreme, isn't it, from the culture. It's a culture shock from where they've come to where they are. Whereas if we place them in the Royal, and we've got that structure around, and everything's there as one community, so they've got their education, they've got their, they've got another community of young people, the unaccompanied asylum seeker children that are already placed there. So it just works really well in that model. Again, there are some barriers, like Mark said, in terms of the structure and the regime. So they might have come from a particular situation straight away, they're into a structure, and this is what you need to do. And I think that's why it's really important then to include the therapeutic support and that element. So Mark was just touching there around, having this team around these young people when they are placed into a boarding provision. So we've got our child adolescent mental health service, we've got our refugee and migrant centres that support as well. We've got a range of interpreters, we've got a range of support around these young people when they're placed into a boarding provision. So I think that's really key, just to make that clear, really, that when we do it because it's a needs-led, and we think it suits the needs of that particular cohort of young people. And as Mark said, we've had 17 young people placed with him, and we've had positive outcomes for the majority of those young people. So that's really key. Another example where we use boarding provision. So we've got a young person at the moment who is a day pupil. His placement is instructing with his foster carer. So he asked if he could stay at the boarding provision as a bit of a time out, as a respite placement, a break from his foster carers. And actually that worked really well. He was there for a week and actually asked to stay at the boarding provision as a long-term placement. So again, we listen to the wishes and feelings of the children. We're not placing children in a boarding provision as a resource or as as a means to kind of free up other foster placements. We're doing it because it's around the needs of the young people. That was another example of where that's worked really well, and actually with the relationship with the foster carers has worked really well. So I sit in, and I'm a service manager for children and people in care. I'm really keen to know how it links in and how it can be preventative in terms of the edge of care cohort of young people. That for me is really interesting, because obviously I work with the children in care cohort, and how it can be used creatively again, but as a means to support families, to sustain those families. So as Dr. Ruth was talking earlier, it's about sustaining those family relationships. In terms of kinship, or what we call in Wolverhampton connected carers, so when children and people coming into care, we assess family members before we look at placing into foster care provision. With that in mind, we would assess particularly grandparents, aunts, uncles, and I used to be a team manager for the Connected Persons Assessment Team, and actually there are occasions now that I can think of where, had we thought about this as a resource, we could potentially have kept the young person with a connected carer and actually used a boarding provision to sustain and support that placement. So to give an example, we might have had a grandparent who wasn't able to commit full-time, to particularly young person might have really wanted to stay with their grandparents. And actually there was some barrier in the way for that grandparent being able to do that full-time, whether it's young person's behaviour or other commitments. We've had grandparents who are also carers to their elderly relatives. So we would have been able to use that boarding provision. So I was really interested as well to read how that can be used in the future. And that's certainly something I've taken back to Wolverhampton. We're talking to Mark around whether we can use that going forward around connected carers in Wolverhampton. And again, we've got some young people. So I've recently written a paper around residential provision in general. So in Wolverhampton, we have got a sequential approach to sourcing placements. So we go for internal foster carers first when a child comes into care. If we haven't got an internal carer, we'd go to an independent foster agency. And if we haven't got an independent foster agency, we usually then look at a residential provision. And the culture really in Wolverhampton needs to be, this is the last resort for young people, this is a residential provision. We're kind of shifting that focus a little bit, and that would include boarding placements as well, where actually we're not looking at residential as a last resort, because for some young people, and again we're talking about a small cohort of young people, some young people would be best suited in a residential or a boarding provision, because actually they're not going to be well suited with into a nuclear family model, or they're not going to fit into families due to their attachment disorders, or for whatever reason they're going to reject placement after placement. In the paper I wrote, one young person, for example, had 14 placements before we looked at a residential provision for them. So we did some research around, if we actually looked at a residential provision, or we looked at, a boarding provision at an earlier stage, then we might be able to stabilise that at earlier stage for that young person, rather than having multiple placement breakdowns along the way. I think that's really key again, and again, that's talking to the young people, listening to actually what the young people want out of the placement. And whether that's foster family, or would they prefer to be in a setting that's structured and not the kind of family model. In terms of, I don't think there's anything else of what Dr. Bruce was talking about. I suppose our challenges in Wolverhampton in terms of placements are around our older young people and our sibling groups, and that's nationally. So all local authorities struggle to find placements for older young people. And again, is that where I know both Mark and Dr. Wood are talking about how it's better to have younger young people to get the better outcomes, but actually where we're struggling to place some of our older people because they're breaking down those placements, do we stop and think, actually, would this model work better for our older young people? In terms of, what else do I want to talk about? So in terms of the paper that I wrote as well, so for we did an audit of 10 young people that have recently changed their placement types. So they've changed their placement types from foster care to a residential or a boarding provision. We've looked at why that changed, and again, was it due to provision or was it due to the needs of the young people? And actually 50% was due to the young people. So we're supporting our social workers at the moment, which I think is really key. Because of the shift in the culture in Wolverhampton, we're supporting social workers to be able to assess the needs of the child and be confident enough to say, actually, we think this is going to be better suited to the young person rather than a foster placement. And giving them the skills and confidence and the assessment ability to be able to make that decision to kind of lead that way. So actually we're looking at residential as a first placement or boarding as a first placement rather than as a last resort for young people. as I think I've talked about, insecure attachments. The only other thing in Wolverhampton that we do, which I think in terms of the logistics of how this would work, so I know I gave the example of a young person where we looked at a respite arrangement, where he went to, it was a day pupil and he went into the boarding provision for a week. Actually, that worked really well. He did actually want to stay in a boarding provision, but he then changed his mind, wanted to go back to his foster placement. So it was a short-term arrangement. Actually, when we look at children that go into a residential, we're always looking down to step them back down to foster placement. So although we'll put them into a residential provision, and again, similarly, if we use boarding in the same way, we will then always be looking down to step them back into a family model. So I suppose it would be the logistics of how that would work. Mark would be looking at a short term. You've got young people kind of coming and going short term, as opposed to that unaccompanied asylum seekers as when they arrive. There isn't really a plan for the unaccompanied asylum seekers to step back into a foster provision. They're there until, you know, they're supported into independence or into university. So that's something that we need to look at in Wolverhampton, about how we either step down into other models of placement types, if we're using boarding provision as a short-term measure, I suppose, to be able to work with that young people. So particularly the young people that are rejecting the family model or reject every foster placement that you put in there and break that down. If we can get them into a boarding provision, or we can get them into a residential provision, and we can do that work with them and the therapeutic support that they need to then be able to step them into a foster placement after that. I suppose just echoing really a lot of what Mark's already said. You know, when it works well, it really works well. There are some challenges. There are some occasions where we probably need to look at our support offer a bit more, because these young people, particularly going back to the asylum seeker children, when they arrive in the country, we've got very little information about them, very little on half a page of A4. And like Mark said, it's very last minute, particularly if we get the phone call from Kent. You know, we're part of the national transfer scheme, and we could be taking 2 young people kind of every couple of weeks at the moment. And we haven't got that luxury or that time to fully assess the needs of that young person. So we're very reliant on placing the young person there and then kind of trying to put all that support in place. And the majority of the time that works really well and we can do it, but there are occasions where that's not going to work in that provision, and we have to be creative as to what we do then with those young people. I suppose in summary, just to kind of summarise really, we're talking about a small cohort of young people. We're not looking at all our children and people in care being right or suitable for the boarding provision, because that's not going to be the case. But where it works for a small cohort and it's needs-led rather than resource-led, I really believe that it's a positive, and actually we're really fortunate in Wolverhampton to have the relationship that we've got with the Royal, and the relationship we've got with Mark and all the staff there to be able to make it work where we need to make it work.
That's great, Kate. Thank you very much. And you have your timing is impeccable. Not sure whether it's your timing or Adonis's timing, which is impeccable, but both are impeccable. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. I'll just quickly do a round of introductions, just so you know who people are. I'm Susie Hawkes, and obviously we've not met, but we've been communicated over email, and I'm a principal lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton, and I've organised this webinar. We've got Dr. Ruth Brading from Christ's Hospital, and Ruth has already spoken about the history of Christ's Hospital School and how they support young people from disadvantaged backgrounds in their school. Next we had Mark Haywood, who's from the Royal at Wolverhampton, talking about his provision, which is a state boarding school, and how they work with Wolverhampton City Council mainly, and take young people, and particularly around unaccompanied asylum seekers. And with Kate Robinson from the Wolverhampton City Council has just spoken. Kate is the service manager for looked after children and care leavers at Wolverhampton, and they've placed 17 children with the Royal at Wolverhampton. And so Kate was talking about her experiences of using the boarding school system for children in the care system. So yes, so for people, other attendees at the webinar, obviously Lord Adonis has now, Andrew Adonis has now joined us. So I will hand over to you, Andrew. I did explain at the outset that you yourself were in care and attended a boarding school, and academically that was and was a very successful thing for you. You went to Oxford, I understand, and then you've got a PhD from Oxford, and obviously have had a political career, and you have been a supporter of the use of boarding schools, and were involved in the Pathfinders programme, which I outlined a little bit at the beginning. So I'll hand over to you. So thank you for coming, and I'll over to you.
Thanks, Susie, and well done on getting this session together. I didn't just go to a boarding school. I was actually placed there and paid for by Camden Council, so it was a pretty much exact replica of the Pathfinder and assisted boarding programs, which I know you've been talking about, and people do. What do I think about it? I think it should be an option. It's obviously going to be horses for courses, and it'll be suitable for as a proportion of those children who are in care, probably quite a small number, but nonetheless it should be an option. And for those for whom it is suitable, it could be transformational, and those for whom it's suitable are likely to be those for whom there'll be greater stability of education by boarding, that there is a context in which they have some either foster or home base which they can combine with a boarding school, because of course a boarding school can't be a total provision in the way that a foster placement or can be. But that for some children could be exactly what they need. A partial was essentially, in terms of the duration of the year, a partial placement, but one that is very focused on their education and gives stability to the education. And I've always been slightly bemused by the criticism. There's a lot of social workers who don't like this at all, and I just thoroughly bemused by it, because what should happen is it should be an option. There's always a danger of trying to universalize these things. The fact that it might be suitable for a small number doesn't mean it won't be transformational for that small number. It shouldn't be an option. And the Pathfinder programme, which I started, was attempting to establish it as a more credible option for social work, but for placements for children in care at the disposal of social workers. And the Pathfinder's policy had established exactly what I thought it would actually. None of it surprised me at all, which is that for some it was transformational. For others, it didn't work. There were issues to do with establishing the right context. More experienced social workers found it easier to handle than those who were less experienced, and part of the problem with placements was part of the problem with social work at large, which was rapid turnover of social workers and casework and so on, which meant that there wasn't this stability of attention, which is often required for social workers to make a professional judgment as to whether this might be suitable in an individual case. And I think continuing to punt it out there as an option, particularly in respect to boarding schools that have a boarding mission rather than an elite education mission. There are two types of boarding school. There are boarding schools whose basic raison d'etre is elite education. I mean, they may say that they do a bit of assisted boarding and all that, but it's very much a sideline. It's not their main activity. And there are schools like mine, Kingham Hill in Oxfordshire, that was established 150 years ago as a home, not even as a school, as a home, which provided education to get orphans out of the East End of London, whose whole mission is assisted boarding, and has become a conventional school over time. And Christ Hospital is very much in that tradition, and there are many others. And I think this is going to be much more suitable for them. I think it should be a bigger part of what state boarding schools do, whatever it is, 30, 35 state boarding schools. And when I was minister, I tried to encourage them to take assisted boarding more seriously, and in in funding we gave them to expand, put this at the core of their mission. But as I say, it's horses for courses, and I think it's valuable to keep it open as an option. I think where it's not an option, a lot of children for whom it could be transformational don't even get the opportunity. And I think that's an enormous pity. And I hope that it can be steadily expanded on that basis.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, just to, I've got a couple of questions to ask the panel, but anyone who has any questions, if I could just ask you to place them in the Q&A section about any questions about the use of boarding places, then we will I will ask them to the panel. One of my questions that I'd come across when I was reading about use of boarding schools was, I think, and I think one of the report into Pathfinders identified was the importance of appropriate provision for schools like the Royal, which can't accommodate children over holidays, and I imagine is a particular problem for asylum seeking children who don't have that. Their very problem is that they don't have family here, is that they will need a placement over the holidays. And how does that, what I was interested in is how you manage that. I imagine that there's two ways. You can either allocate a foster carer that remains sort of dormant and becomes active, or you allocate a new foster carer or placement every holiday, which I imagine brings its problems. I imagine each has a separate problem. One has one of a retainer and the other has one of instability for the young person. So I was just wondering how those are managed. I guess, Kate, you're the best person to start with on that question.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so we do. And I think both of those examples that you gave are really good. So for some young people, they've got a set arrangement with a foster carer that they go to every holiday. So, you know, it's quite easy to maintain and set that arrangement up. And it works well in terms of stability for that young person. They know they go there over Christmas or they go there in the summer, and then they come back to boarding and there's no issues. But other young people, sometimes we have to find different placements for them each time. But we do well in advance, so we know in terms of the timetable, we know when the timetable's coming up, and we get that set up, and where possible we can do that in a planned way, so the young person can meet the foster carer beforehand, they know where they're going, and there's a link then between the Royal School as well, so it's all managed in a well kind of managed way.
Yeah, I would agree with Kate. It's interesting that for some of ours, some of them like the consistency that they get from the same carer each holiday. As I said earlier, we remain open during our half terms to try and avoid that disruption, and certainly during COVID, since March 2020, we've been open, apart from the 7 weeks of Christmas, of the summer holidays, we've been open throughout that and had staffing throughout that, particularly for our unaccompanied asylum seekers, and looked after children to give them that stability where it was very difficult for Kate and the team to find suitable placements. But there are others where each holiday is a fresh start for them, and some of them like, there's one I'm aware of who actually likes the change and the different family setting that they go into. And for a chap called Ali I mentioned earlier, you know, he's going to a different one this Christmas because it's actually closer to school, so he can keep in touch. That actually in the centre of the town, rather than actually a remote part of the town where he can't get out and about so much, given that he hasn't got much transport. So I think it varies, and I think it is, as Kate was saying, as much advance notice as possible is really helpful, and that's the same for our looked after children, where the placements aren't always stable, and for various reasons notice is given with the 28 days notice for the foster carers. But it can also, when we have a liaison with those foster families, enhance what we do together, and all of it comes back down to communication, I think, to making sure that we all have the child at the centre of what we're thinking, and making sure that all parts of their experience are joined up, and that's certainly my view, and that works well. And it's a bit like the unaccompanied asylum seekers in terms of arrival. finding foster families in a city like Wolverhampton, which has such a high number of looked after children and vulnerable youngsters in the area, I wouldn't envy Kate and her team's job in trying to find those people and making sure they're all suitable and fully focused on what they want to do. But when it does work, it can work really well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a challenge, let's say, that the care review has been talking about, is the challenge of placements. I know when I left frontline practice in May 2020, I think we were in the local authority I was working for, that we had 60 young people who we were trying to find placements for. So it is definitely a challenge, which is why I think having the option is something that's, let's say, the merits of the option for some young people, let's say, although I think we recognise that they're a minority, are important. Ruth, did you have anything you wanted? What are your experiences of the holidays?
Yeah, I think with the children who are with us, most of them have had a steady, consistent holiday placement. In some cases, that has held, and been successful, in part because the child is coming to us for the term time. So sometimes those family placements, those foster placements, have come under pressure, but they've managed to get through the difficult times because of the respite that's been provided by the child coming to us for those term times. In a couple of instances, our children have had, they have been in a family placement that has broken down, and their social worker has had to find them a new placement. And that's been really difficult, but it's been good that at least they've had a thread of consistency and continuity and stability, in that the school placement has continued. So one part of their provision is, sadly broken down, but at least another part of it has worked. And in that sense, it can be helpful to have those two strands. So sort of all the eggs aren't in one basket, in a sense. But yeah, I think where we really see success is when our children, we've got a number who are with grandparents or other family members who find it hard to be the primary carers for those children, but it works well because some of the strain, if you like, is taken by the boarding placement, balancing out the family placement.
Yeah, I think, I think I said at the beginning, after our discussion when I was arranging this, it was interesting to me that was that you predominantly took children who were vulnerable and disadvantaged, and actually who remained with their families. And I think, as Kate, you were saying, that's something that you would be interested in looking into. And I think that diversity of children who potentially could be supported is interesting. Andrew, did you have anything you wanted to say in relation to the placement, the sort of placement in holidays?
Well, it clearly has to be a factor in deciding whether it's suitable, doesn't it?
Mm.
For those for whom it is possible to make an arrangement either through the school, one that's workable for the individual child, or with a sort of partial fostering arrangement, then that's fine. But the fact that it's the point I would just like to come back to is that the fact that this would only be a small number for whom this might work doesn't mean it shouldn't apply to them. That's surely the point here is, and with a bit of creative thinking, in cases where a boarding placement might be suitable, it could be made to work. It requires sometimes a bit of creative thinking on the part of social workers.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, thank you. So I'll ask, we've got 3 questions in. I'll start with one because Mark, you've answered one in writing, so I'll give you an opportunity to speak to it if you wish. But yeah, so the first question is, does having boarding schools where the curriculum is much better than standard schools mean that we are continuing a bigger class divide? And I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's an important question because I think it speaks to a lot of people's concerns around it, around the use of boarding schools. So yeah, I don't know. Do you want to start, Mark, because you've already responded in writing, but I think it'd be useful for people to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah,
and we were an independent school. We're now an academy, and therefore under Ofsted guidance. My strong view is that any school can do what we do. we're a state-funded school. We use our funds to enrich and to set aspirational targets for every child that walks through the front door. I don't think that it's going to widen the divide. I think it's just going to, I think every school should be looking to do this. So the fact that we have 100 different enrichment activities per week, we're state funded. We don't get any additional funding other than the EHCP, pupil premium free school meals that other schools will get. It's how you use it and where your priorities and your vision lies for every child, whether they happen to be a vulnerable child, an unaccompanied asylum seeker, a looked after child, or just a child from down the road whose parents want them to have that form of education. So I don't think, I can see why people might think that, but I don't think this is about social engineering other than making sure that everybody has opportunities. My urge is that everybody is ambitious and aspirational for our children, and not to find barriers to that, but to try and find solutions and to my staff give 2 activities per week that they offer. It's contractual, and we use our freedoms in order to make sure that delivers. They enjoy the experience. They get a different relationship with the young people. This is what they reflect back to me, and through their PRD, and everybody benefits. So I don't think that it should widen that divide. I think it should just make sure that we have a more aspirational culture for everybody to benefit from. And where we have young people who've had a really poor start in life, why shouldn't they have access to this? And I think, as Andrew's saying, it may be for a small cohort, but that cohort will go into the world of education and work elsewhere and cascade that experience to others. And we do need to be ambitious. We can't play to the lowest common denominator that, no, it's impossible and it's furthering a divide. I don't think it does.
Thank you, Mark. Andrew, do you want to respond? I imagine this is an issue you've faced a number of times. Yeah,
it's a totally absurd question. And I see the person who asked it describes him or herself as anonymous in the thing. It's totally absurd. There is no such thing as a standard school. It's massive ignorance of the education system. I think there's a standard school out there, your sort of vision of a rundown comprehensive, and people who go to different schools get much better education. That's not the case at all. The diversity of schools in the state system is huge. We want all schools to level up in the current mantra to be as good as the best. The best state schools are outstanding in their curriculum. The idea they have a stunted and restricted curriculum shows just massive ignorance of the state system. There are plenty of huge numbers of schools which have state funding and those which have charitable funding on top, which provide an extraordinarily good curriculum. And then to the second point, which Mark said, the idea that for those people who start off with the least advantaged backgrounds, that it should somehow be exacerbating a class divide to give them the best that the education system can offer, I think is sort of, just looking at the wrong end of the telescope. So I don't think we need to go there at all.
Thank you. Ruth, have you got anything you want to say, or do you want to add anything?
I think Mark kind of covered my points broadly, but I would say perhaps slightly differently to Lord Adonis that, yeah, there's a big philosophical, political question to be asked, not just about boarding, but about independent schools, about grammar schools. Of course there is. But I would say that where schools are there and able to offer what might be a fantastic opportunity for a young person who needs it most, then I hope that people would think about the particular rather than about the sort of theoretical question, and would think, here's an option for this child that could really, really work for them. I mean, our school, what we're all about is giving places to children who need them for whatever reason. So in a way, social mobility is what we're about, with our bursaries making it possible for children from any background to come here, but also children come to us to boarding for all sorts of other reasons. Lots of our children have got a parent who's desperately ill, or a sibling who has really high needs and takes up a lot of the time and the care that the parents can give. And so for those sorts of reasons, coming away to boarding and being looked after here by us and enjoying their childhood without those cares sort of to deal with every day is really helpful to them. So thinking about just the particular and what we offer, it's something that I really believe in, kind of putting aside the big philosophical, political questions, I think.
I think people are voting with their feet. You know, we have for our year 7 places, we've just got the numbers. We've got 956 people applying for our day places, let alone our boarding places. And, you know, we don't advertise. We produce the materials we have to, but actually, I think that says that people actually want this this enrichment and having a community based within their community where actually we focus on the individual, we focus on personal development and the well-being of youngsters, because if you get that right, the educational element will absolutely follow, and there's lots of evidence to prove that. So we focus very strongly on personal development. You know, we don't bang on about kind of 9 to 7s and the grades, because we expect that to be done. That's normal. But what we do want to do is create confident, well-adjusted young people who can play in teams, who can be leaders, and have the range of skills that employers and universities are going to be desiring, so that they get first choice when they get to interview. And we take it for granted, along with all of the extra work that we do on the academic profile, that if we get people who are in the right place mentally and are supported throughout their journey, they're going to do well, and they do.
Yeah, and it is worth remembering actually that you are a state school, and actually that as Andrew says, that there are 35 state boarding schools in the country. So we're not actually just talking about private education, we're talking about the use of boarding schools for disadvantaged children as a placement option for children who may be struggling to live with their families. And perhaps that speaks to some of the limited understanding of the scheme, but I think that has been a problem, and it is like Ruth, I think I would agree with you, like you say, that there is that ideological issue which needs to be at least discussed in order to address it. Kate, is there anything you want to add? Oh, sorry, did you say no? Is that what you're saying?
I was trying to get off mute. No, right. Sorry, nothing to add to that point.
All right, no, that's it. Sorry, I'm muting myself. I shall look at the other questions. So, yeah, this might be one that Andrew, I think you could answer. Warren asks, are any of today's panel aware of any research finding and data that's underpin and support findings of positive outcomes for young people who've attended assisted boarding schools?
Well, there was the evaluation of the Pathfinders, which showed that for some of the students, it made a big stroke transformational difference. For others it didn't, and for others it didn't work out at all. Most research, in my experience, is a statement of the blindingly obvious, and that doesn't surprise me at all. For some, it's transformational, where the relationship works between the school, the child, and any those who are responsible for them. In some cases, it doesn't work, and in some cases it has a neutral impact. Those are the research findings I've seen. When the Pathfinder research findings came out, there were critics who said that this shows that it doesn't work because it didn't work for all of them. Well, the fact that it didn't work for all of them didn't mean it wasn't transformational for some of them. And the key finding in there, and I remember looking at the case studies they did, is that for a number of the children, it was positive stroke transformational. And that's the point, because the point is then to seek to expand and make more widely available opportunities which match those of the group for whom it was transformational. And that means more schools, more professional staff, more finely tuned social worker judgments to make those connections.
Sorry, thank you, Andrew. Does anyone else want to, is anyone else familiar with the research and wants to speak to it? I do know some of it, so I can add some of it. So there is, I did do
University of Cardiff, I can't remember who did the evaluation. I think evaluation for the Pathfinders, it was South Wales University.
Yeah, I can add, I'll I'll try and add that, because I have got the Pathfinders report, so I can add a link to it because it's available on the internet. I think that there has been some limited research that I found from Roger Moran did some research. And I think, again, that I think probably the things that we've already discussed are the key issues that are identified, and that is that you need to get the children, that the selection of the right children, the right child is appropriate. The importance of the child and the family buying into it, that it wasn't appropriate for so one of the research says that many of the boarders had been closely involved in the decision to go to boarding school, so involving the young people in that decision to go to boarding school, and if they bought into it, that meant that it was more likely to be beneficial. I think some of the benefits were around the sort of social skills. So for children who were, as Ruth said, who were academically able, those with good social, those with big advancements were seen in young people in terms of their social skills, the skills that Mark was talking to in terms of those sort of soft skills that gave them, that would confer advantages alongside the education when they get into the workforce, around being able to work together, working teams, self-confidence, self-esteem. So that the schools were very successful in that regard. There were also that was linked to the things, actually some of the things that Ruth was saying right in the beginning, which were around being around other young people, is actually those opportunities to develop peer relationships, and to sort of it was those relationships that often were very supportive, and the availability of a wide range of people. So actually what they didn't have, these were children who benefited from having lots of adults rather than just one adult, so those children really benefited from that diversity. Is actually for the children who'd been introduced very well to the school, that what they found in this research was that actually the children had a good understanding of what boarding school was about, and that actually they were pleased with when they'd gone, that their expectation was consistent with that. They talked about bullying and the fact that it was pretty similar to other schools, that there was not a lot of difference in terms of, so there was bullying, but it was very similar to when they were in other schools. And the other thing this research pointed out was the fact of choice. So I think Kate was talking a little bit about that, and that was that this was about offering choice to young people. So quite often young people who would offered the option of a foster placement or this, or a residential placement or this, they would, if they chose the boarding option, as I think the example Kate gave a little bit earlier of the boy who'd gone in for respite and then said, actually, I wanted this, that those placements were generally successful. So hopefully that answers the question. It's not, I don't think I've read all of the research, but I did do quite a bit of research before doing this webinar. Oh, Lord Adonis is I had to leave, so as I say, thank you, but he's gone, I think. Anyway, the next question. Oh, sorry, there's somebody had asked about one directly to Andrew Adonis. Obviously, I won't be able to ask that now. So Leah has asked, how can more understanding of the merits of looked after children and edge of care placement into boarding be disseminated more broadly across local authorities? Which I think is a good question, because as I say, I think one of the things that I have come up against is that actually there is quite a lot of hostility to the idea in principle, which I think I read a report from one local authority that said that was a barrier to them using it. It was something they had to consider, that it attracted a lot of criticism if they used boarding places. So Kate, do you want to, what are your thoughts around that, being a local authority that uses it in terms of
yeah, so I suppose linking to the question around the research findings as well, because I can only speak really from our own positive experiences and our outcomes that we've got in Wolverhampton, but I suppose linking to the two questions, I would be really keen to speak to the local authorities to see how they use boarding provisions and what their views are around it, particularly I suppose for the preventative area for educare young people, and particularly around the connected carers. So that's something that we haven't got experience of in Wolverhampton, and I would be really keen to speak to other local authorities about. In terms of their view, I suppose once I speak to them, I'll be able to gather their views and I'll be able to share our experiences, how it's worked but I run a couple of asylums with young people. I do sit on quite a few regional network meetings with other local authorities about different areas. So I sit on one for US, for example, I sit on one for care leaders, where I can tap into that resource and ask those questions in those forums. I know that local authority within that forum used a boarding provision for our unafforded families with children, so that's really interesting. So perhaps I could share that experience with them in those forums.
Thank you, Kate. Ruth, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I really would like to just say, I think you can't beat coming to have a look. I know it's time consuming, but if people can contact boarding schools that they think might be able to help them with placements, and arrange to come and see what it's really like, that's just so helpful, because it just gives you that first-hand understanding of what it is that you're looking at potentially for your children. So just before this webinar today, I was just chatting with our designated safeguarding lead, and I said, oh, I've got to go and join this webinar about boarding placements for looked after children and so on. And she said, oh, actually, we've just had another communication. We think we've got another looked after child who's going to join us next year in year 9. And I said, oh, great. How's this one come about? And she said, it's one of the social workers of one of our current children. And this child, when he joined us, he lived with his mum. But during the years that he's been here, he's actually become a looked after child, and he now lives with Granny. And as I was saying earlier, we've been that kind of the stable bit, the continuity whilst that difficult situation played out in his family life. And his social worker, didn't know anything about our school or boarding school, but has been here lots of times to visit him and to meet with our staff here. And now she's got another child that she thinks, oh, we could be the right place for this child too. So I think, it's time consuming, but these personal connections, relationships, come and have a look, contact schools so that you really understand what they might be able to offer. And I think that's how to get the word out, because it's boarding school is a strange thing, isn't it? It's an unfamiliar thing to most people. As I was trying to convey in my little talk at the beginning, I think people, there are certain things they understand about boarding school, but there are other things that they need to come and see, really. So that would be my advice.
That's great, thank you. I have a feeling that we have someone who's in the audience, Ali, who I wonder if Ali has been talking about. She's put in the chat, any local authority interested in hearing more about all the boarding schools who have signed up to the DFE's scheme, please do get in contact with us from this Royal Springboard. So I'm going to speculate that Ali is from Royal Springboard, and Ali, I'm not sure whether Ali, I'm just speculate Ali maybe an Alison, but I'm not certain. Has put a link in the chat, so that might be something that people who are interested could follow through. But it is the Royal, for people who are watching this webinar later, where you won't have access to the chat, it is the Royal Springboard. It's www.royalspringboard.org.uk/looked-after-children. So yeah, so that's hopefully is people can get some more information. Mark, did you want to say anything in addition about how we make it more well known?
Well, one is that you're right, Ali is a lady, and I sent her the link actually because we spoke this morning, so I'm to blame for Ali kind of being here, but she's fantastically successful with the Springboard, who's kind of these RNCF and other trusts have kind of merged and do some fabulous work, and I'm sure Ruth has a number of the youngsters too, for a whole range of young people in difficult circumstances, with financial support as well as kind of pastoral and well-being support in the background. So I would thoroughly recommend anybody contact Ali, because she's got a fantastic knowledge of the sector, state boarding as well as independent boarding. I think it's been a challenge, and as far as I'm aware, we're the only state boarding school that actually works in this way, and certainly the BSA suggests that that's the case, and I can't see why. I've written articles for the BSA magazine. I'll talk to anybody who will listen to me about the benefits, not only for the young people but for the community more widely, because they don't shout about that they're refugees or they're migrants. but actually it gets known and it gets absorbed into the culture of the organisation, so it becomes a normal. And the teachers and support staff love working with these youngsters, because in most cases they're hungry to make progress and to learn and to make a success of life. I've spoken at conferences and webinars. I don't know what the reticence for others to get involved is. And perhaps it's just a different kind of school. Perhaps we come from a different starting point, in the same way that Ruth School, starts out as a philanthropic organisation rather than as a kind of an independent school for selective academic progress, which is where I think the misunderstanding comes. And the breadth of independent schools alone, and also state boarding schools, in terms of what we do, I think the organisations are trying to get information out there. I think there's in Sunday Times this week, there was again another article about boarding schools from historical times, and I think that probably still clouds a little bit of people's decisions in terms of, are they still those institutions that are regimented and whatever, and that couldn't be further from the truth in terms of the way that they're governed, they're managed, and they're overseen by the organisations that check up in CQC and Ofsted and ISI. There's a very much, it's a caring environment, which is what independent and state boarding schools are about. It's a nurturing environment, which is so very different from perhaps the institutional organisations that would have been there in the early 1900s. So I think I would agree absolutely with Ruth. People come across the doorstep, meet the kids, because they're just normal kids. Come and walk around and spend a day following a child and to see what their experience is like from 7 in the morning till 6:30 at night. I think that would be a really interesting experience for social workers, particularly to come and actually have a look and walk the walk that the kids have, because for most parts it's a normal day, and they just happen to be in a setting where some 100 youngsters stay here overnight, and they're friends with others, and they have sleepovers in the city with their friends, because predominantly we're a day school. So come and see it. We have an open invitation, as I'm sure Ruth does. Come and have a look. Come and talk to us. Come and talk to the kids. See what their experience is like, what their lived experience is like. Because I agree with Andrew to some extent. For some, it works fabulously well, and it is absolutely life changing. For others, it's just okay. So I've been there. I've done that. I've got the qualifications. And for a very small minority, it doesn't work in that way. I think come and have a look, come and talk to us, come and meet the kids.
Yeah, and I think that it is worth reiterating that in the work that I did in preparing for this, is that actually I think one of the barriers is that quite the idea that boarding schools are cold and inhospitable, unkind places, whereas I think actually modern boarding schools are well equipped, nurturing, that are very much drawing on, that they're not this sort of 19th century sort of Charles Dickens type institutions that I think people perhaps have in their mind, that actually they're often schools with broad, and I think you Mark spoke to the fact that there's often international students, so actually they're often more diverse than people imagine. They think they're often very heavily white, when actually they're not, because there's a lot of, even in the big private schools, they have a lot of young people who come in from abroad, so they are wealthy, but actually even in I'm talking about those private schools that are elite educational institutions, but they still actually are quite diverse. So I think that it was interesting in the research around private schools and the sector, to see that there is this diversity even within the independent sector of schools, and actually you need to look at individual schools for the right school, as well as the right place, as well as the right child for the right school at the right time, is I think, and that was a quote from one of the pieces of research that I read, was the right school for the right child at the right time. So yeah, thank you.
I think finally, if I just add one thing, I think it's the word stability is really important for these youngsters, because many of whom have had very difficult backgrounds. If they're living and studying in the same place, and they're also having fun in the same place, whether it's a weekend activities, Wednesday night boarding activity, or going into our swimming pool or the sports pitches and having the extended day with their mates all around them, you know, it is a stable environment, that it doesn't move much, whereas many of them are subject to frequent moves and frequent changes. And over a period of time, that can actually lead to them taking leadership roles within school, and beginning to turn over the modelling, as I said earlier, which is where instability and chaos is the norm, whereas schools are actually very stable places for the most part. So I think that's probably really helpful.
That's helpful, thank you. So I'll just ask that there's one final question really, and then I'll just deal with Sukhvir's comment. So Sukhvir, I think, has written in the chat that she's just come from Walsall Council, which is obviously a local council to Wolverhampton, and doesn't believe that they consider boarding as an option. And I think Sukhvir, she said, thanks, good to hear, Mark, thank you. I suspect what Sukhvir means is that that'd be something she could feed back to Walsall in terms of coming to visit the school and looking at the potential of the Royal as a placement option. So hopefully it might we might be able to expand the use in this area. So finally, the question is from Ali, and I'll read it out. So yes, it's interesting to hear that the DFE is support to boarding schools for vulnerable children, and the contract awarded to it's RNCSF, which I think is, I'm trying to think what that stands for. Do you know what it stands for, Mark, off the top of your head?
The Royal National Children's Springboard Foundation.
Thank you, that's helpful. It's not well understood. Springboard have been seeking referrals of lack or unaccompanied asylum seeking, I think it's minors, for boarding opportunities across the 125 schools committed to prioritise these pupils in their bursary schemes. I think that's quite interesting. That's a lot of schools, isn't it? 125 schools. I wonder how we can ensure this scheme is more widely understood. And then the question was actually to Lord Adonis, but generally, does Lord Adonis think that it might be possible to see this as part of a commissioning guidance for local authorities one day, which is, let's say, perhaps something that can't be answered fully right now, but I think it's an important thing to consider. Katrina, can I ask, is it part of your guidance? Is it integrated into your guidance around commissioning?
Sorry, I lost you a little bit then, it just froze when I was trying to unmute. Sorry, could you repeat the question? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm on mute as well. So yeah, the question was, does Lord Adonis think that it might be possible to see this as part of commissioning guidance for local authorities one day? I was just wondering if it was embedded in your guidance around, is it considered widely as a placement option for all young people that come through?
I don't know whether it would be by commissioning, but it's certainly something that we consider for as a placement option in terms of our placement model. When we look at young people coming into care, yeah, it's certainly on our radar. But like I said, it's mainly for our own company. So where we're looking at other options, particularly for the connected, that's something that I'm going to take back today and see if we can widen that even further.
That's fantastic, thank you. And we've just had Dwayne has just put that it's not a question but a comment, a brilliant topic and panel. These conversations, debates are needed to help workers in diverse local authorities to understand what is available and to understand what maybe some of the misconceptions are and share experiences. Thank you. Hope to see some more webinars in 2022. Yes, we will definitely have more webinars in 2022, and thank you, Dwayne, for your comment. I think that is all of the comments, other than there was one for Andrew Adonis, which is very particular, and so it's not possible for anyone else to answer it. So I'm sorry about that I didn't ask that question whilst he was here. So, and I don't know, is there anything that anyone wants to say in terms of sort of some final comments? No.
Just thank you,
Mark.
Susie. I think it's been really good to have the opportunity to kind of explore the range of different things that are available for young people, particularly those most vulnerable people. I think it's a really important thing that Springboard, Christ's Hospital School, and ourselves, and a range of others. We're just a small part of that. And as they say on the adverts, other brands do exist, and I think it's important for people to explore a range of different settings, because children are individuals, and we need to put the best support around those as individuals that make up those communities. But thank you, Susie. Well, great to be part of, and thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you all for coming. I think it's been a really interesting topic. I think it is a sensitive topic, but I think unless we talk about it, people won't understand that there are possibilities. I don't think it will ever be an option for the vast majority of children in care, but actually there is a small subsection of children who are disadvantaged and on the edge of care, and some children who are in care for whom this might be an excellent option. And I think in the context of actually the difficulty we have in finding placements, I think there is reason to be open-minded in terms of what options there are for each individual child, and like you say, to treat each child as an individual within that system, and regardless of the politics of it, because the politics of it that can happen outside, that's not helpful to the children to make decisions for individual children based upon a political sort of approach to it. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. It's really, I really appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone who joined the webinar. The webinar will be available on YouTube within the next couple of days. But again, thank you very much everyone, and hopefully we'll see you in 2022 for the next webinars.
Thank you so much, Susie.
Bye.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.